Alrighty, y'all, so let's talk about seed plants. Here are the learning objectives. So we're going to describe the reproductive adaptations of seed plants and identify the reproductive structures of gymnosperms. Now, before we talk about seed plants, we first want to make sure that we define seed. A seed is a plant embryo and food supply encased or covered in a protective layer. Now, seed plant adaptations that allow them to survive on dry land are as follows: reproduction in either cones or flowers, pollination without standing water, either through wind or through insects, and then having those embryos in seeds, and these seeds can then be dispersed by wind or by animals. Now, in seed plants, the male gametophytes and the female gametophytes grow and mature directly within the sporophyte. The gametophytes usually develop in reproductive structures known as cones or flowers. And we can divide seed plants into two groups on the basis of which of these structures they have. So we have gymnosperms and angiosperms. So that's going to be whether they have cones or flowers. Nearly all gymnosperms bear their seeds directly on the scales of cones. So here we have our gymnosperms seeds located on the scale. So we can see here we have the male cones, which produce the male gametophytes or pollen grain, and those pollen are going to be carried by wind to the female cones, which are the female gametophytes, and then that's going to produce our seeds. We also have our angiosperms, and these are going to be our flowering plants. Now, flowers are going to, for the most part, most flowers produce both the male and the female gametophytes, so they have both male and female parts. In some species, some flowers are male, some flowers are female. Now, with angiosperms, pollen is going to be distributed by wind sometimes, but in many species, animals or insects are going to carry that pollen directly from one flower to another. So we're familiar with bees and butterflies. They're really important pollinators. And then our seeds here, they're enclosed in a layer of ovary tissue. All right, so let's talk about pollen and seeds. Now, in seed plants, the entire male gametophyte is contained within that pollen grain. And pollen can be really small. And I know we're all familiar with pollen because it gives us allergies. Spring is kind of starting to appear. I see that like yellowish stuff on my car when I go outside. And those tiny, tiny structures, that pollen, that is the male reproductive structure. The transfer of pollen from the male reproductive structure to the female reproductive structure is called pollination. So when that pollen makes its way over to the female portion of the plant or the flower, that's pollination. And after fertilization, so that pollen and the egg, they join together. We get a zygote, which gets contained within a seed, and it's going to grow into a tiny plant. This is the sporophyte embryo. Now, a tough seed coat surrounds and protects that embryo, and it's going to keep the contents of the seed from drying out. Seeds can survive long periods of bitter cold, extreme heat, even drought. The embryo will start to grow when conditions are once again right. So when we have water, when there's the right amount of light. It does this by using nutrients from the stored food supply until it can carry out photosynthesis on its own. Alrighty, now reproduction in conifers takes place in cones. So that they should look, those two words are really similar, conifers, cones. Now, pollen cones are the male cones. They produce pollen. It's a gametophyte stage, so it's haploid, N. And then seed cones, they're the female gametophytes, and they are also haploid N. And you can see in this picture, we can see the male cone, or the pollen cone, and you can see that pollen kind of falling off of it. This is the conifer life cycle. So we're starting here with the pollen cone, which is the, if I go back real quick, pollen cone is the male cone. Now that pollen cone is going to release those pollen grains or the male gametophytes. Now we'll also have our seed cone, and these cones have the scales. And on those scales, we have the ovule. And within the ovule, we have the female, actually the ovule is the egg. It is the female gametophyte. And so we're going to have the pollen grains. They're going to reach those egg cells, those ovules. And they're going to actually form this really thin pollen tube, and they're going to fertilize that egg. And so if you notice, once again here, we have this color coding showing us the haploid stage and the diploid stage, and after fertilization, we are now diploid. That's going to develop into a seed now. That seed is going to germinate, which means it'll start to grow. The seed will actually open up as long as conditions are right, and we'll get a seedling, which will eventually grow into a tree, a mature sporophyte, a tree. So in summary, seed plants, they have reproductive adaptations, and in gymnosperms, pollen is directly transferred. Now let's talk about flowering plants, and here are the learning objectives for that. Identify the reproductive structures of angiosperms. So we just went over gymnosperms. These are angiosperms. Identify some of the ways angiosperms can be categorized. So let's look at flowers and fruits. Now, angiosperms, they make up the vast majority of plant species. Angiosperms reproduce sexually by means of flowers. And so here I have a flower. You can see our ovary is in the middle. That is where the ovules and the eggs are, and once those get fertilized, those are the ones that develop into a seed, and those seeds are protected by that ovary. Now, advantages of flowers and fruit. Flowers are a really great evolutionary advantage. They attract pollinators. Flowers usually have bright colors, and sometimes they have really nice smells, and that attracts pollinators like bees and butterflies. And once that flower is pollinated, that ovary of the flower, right, that's part of the flower, it's going to turn it into a fruit. So here we have a blackberry. Now, when we classify angiosperms, we do run into some issues. There is great diversity, so there are a lot of different types of angiosperms, and that's made them kind of difficult to classify. For many years, flowering plants were classified according to the number of seed leaves or cotyledons in their embryos. Those with one seed leaf were called monocots, mono meaning one. Those with two seed leaves were called dicots. At one time, these two groups were considered classes within the angiosperm phylum, and all angiosperms were placed in one class or the other. But things are a little bit different now. You don't need to know all that much about how these guys are classified. I'm going to tell you what you need to know. Now, angiosperms are grouped according to seed leaves, stems, and growing seasons. And so those are the three big things. And so you need to know about monocot versus dicot. And if we break these words up, mono means one, di means two. All right? So monocots, their seeds have what we call a single cotyledon. That is what we call the seed leaf. So you can see monocots, they have the single cotyledon. Their leaves are parallel. The veins of the leaves are parallel. Their flowers are going to be, the petals are going to be in multiples of 3. The vascular bundles, which are the xylem and phloem, which move water up and down, those are scattered throughout the stem, and they have these fibrous roots that kind of spread out through the soil. Now, dicots, they have 2 cotyledons. They have branched veins. Their flowers are often in multiples of 4 or 5, and their vascular bundles are arranged in a ring, and they are going to have these tap roots. So you can see the roots are kind of It's kind of like a cluster of roots all around themselves. Now we can also split angiosperms into woody and herbaceous plants. And so we can subdivide these flowering plants into woody plants, which are primarily of cells with thick cell walls that support that plant body. So you can imagine, as the word implies, they have wood, trees, shrubs, vines. And then we have herbaceous plants. These are smooth and non-woody, so they don't produce wood as they grow. We can also split them by when they flower or how often. So we have annuals, biennials, and perennials. And you might be familiar with these if you've ever been at like the garden section of Home Depot or Lowe's or any gardening store. You can pick up little seed packets, and some of these are, they're going to tell you whether that plant is an annual or a biennial or a perennial. Now, annuals, you can see their lifespan. It's 1 year. They're going to grow from seed to maturity. They'll flower, they'll produce seeds, and they'll die in one growing season. Biennials, they're going to sprout and grow very short stems during year 1. And during year 2, they're going to grow new stems and leaves. They will flower, they will produce seeds, and then they will die. And then we have perennials, and these kind of come back year after year. Most of these have woody stems. Some do have herbaceous stems, so they don't produce wood, and those herbaceous stems would die each winter, but they would be replaced in the spring. And you can see we have examples of each of those annuals, biennials, and perennials. And in summary, angiosperms reproduce sexually by means of flowers. Angiosperms are often grouped according to seed leaves, stems, and the number of growing seasons that they live. Alrighty guys, I wish you a really wonderful and safe spring break. Hopefully you learned. If you have any questions, just shoot me an email. I may or may not answer because I'm on vacation. But you should also be on vacation, so don't send me any emails. Have a great rest of your day. Have fun at field day, and goodbye.